before we start off the session, I'll quickly lay the context for this session. I think it goes without saying that big tech and platform companies are pervasive. It impacts the way we think, the way we speak, and increasingly the way we speak also, and the way we vote. What we have seen is that for the longest time, big tech and platform companies didn't really face any scrutiny or accountability. But in the last few years, it has really changed. What we now know is that systems that have been built by platforms, they're directly linked with growing information, misinformation, polarization, and of course, online hate in our society. In fact, just a week back, Wall Street Journal did a damning report on how Facebook works and how it has long known the kind of dangers it poses to the society and how often it has not really put or implemented the fixes because in order to sort of optimize for the growth. The idea of this session, hence, is to sort of discuss tech reporting and the challenges it faces. I'm a big Markup reader myself, so I have a lot of questions for Julia, who is with us today, especially with the kind of tools Markup uses for their reporting. But in the interest of time, I'll try to keep my questions specific to tech reporting, and if then time permits, maybe I can squeeze in a couple of more questions. So Julia, welcome, and thank you so much for taking out the time.
It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. Julia, let me start off with one thing that I think really makes Markup stand out, which is the use of tech to report on technology or big tech, so to say, right? And if I'm not wrong, half of your newsroom comprises of programmers and data scientists. And that's like a approach which is fairly, say, new or alien to Indian newsrooms, where people who work on tech or are developers, they're not really just working on the tech stack of the website to sort of distribute the content, but they're also effectively journalists and storytellers. So could you just explain it to us why that approach is central to the kind of work Markup does? And what is like a daily day like for a programmer at Markup?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is an experiment in a new kind of newsroom. There aren't that many newsrooms that I know of that have invested so heavily in programmers working as journalists in the newsroom and having such a one-to-one ratio of writers to programmers. The reason I did this is because when you think about what tools journalists have to collect data, right? We interview other people, so we human data collection. We can obtain documents. In the US, we have decent public records laws, so we can request public information, and we can occasionally sue for information, and we can get leaks from employees. But one piece that I felt like was missing from all of that was the fact that automation can help us collect data at scale, right? That's another avenue for journalism. So basically, our programmers are out there scooping up lots of data that is publicly available on the internet, or analyzing public records that we've gotten in some other way, but then ingesting them into a database and analyzing them. That allows us to basically move from the world that journalism is often occupied, which is the three anecdotes, and you have a story, right? Like you find three people who are doing whatever, and you're like, this is a trend, right? Can move to a world where we have more data. And so basically we can say, this isn't just anecdotal, this is actually, a pervasive trend. And we have more evidence that it's really happening in the world. And so that's what I've made my bet on, is that, just like technology companies are using automation to their benefit, journalism should also use automation to its benefit.
Correct. Okay. So just quickly on that, I don't know how, because while I was speaking quickly came off my mind, I don't know how salaries work in US, but like in India, like the kind of salaries tech people draw, it's just like, it's not possible for newsrooms to hire them in reporting role. I think that's one of the challenges with retaining the right tech talent for news organizations also. But moving on, coming back to the approach, I also see that you release whatever data set, code, or whatever database you use for reporting that's like released along with the story. So how essential is that process? Because I think, and your website also reads that you want to rebuild trust in journalism one data set at a point. So from a trust perspective, how important do you think is it to release whatever data set or code you have used in the reporting to sort of building trust with the reader, whoever is reading the story?
Yeah, I mean, you're correct in identifying trust as the issue here, right? I mean, one reason to move from the world of 3 anecdotes to bigger data is to build trust with readers, because honestly, people, at least in the US, have really become pretty cynical about media and what they choose to cover, what they consider news. And so we want to show basically as much as we can, be really transparent. We call it show our work philosophy. So we publish the data, we publish the code we use to analyze the data, we write little notebooks and descriptions of the data itself. We try to be really open kimono about what we're doing, because I think people are desperate for a feeling of something that they can trust out there. There's a lot of news these days that is very much gamed, in the US, I think there's like at least, I think that ratio is 8 PR people to 1 journalist or something, right? So there's so much orchestrated leaks or trial balloons that are floated through the press and all sorts of gamesmanship that happens through the press. And the public has become aware of that and more cynical about it. And we want to be really clear that we're on the side of the public. We're here doing the work to tell the public what's actually going on. We don't want to participate in all of those games. We just want to tell you the truth about what's happening in the world and how you're being affected by it.
Do you think it's even more important because you're reporting on tech, and the biggest of the tech companies have massive PR and media machinery? So like they come back at you saying that your data set or whatever your research only is not credible, and hence your report is not credible. Do you think that by in itself makes it a lot more important to release the data?
I think so. When you're looking at companies like Facebook that basically regulate speech around the world, right? Like there's an argument you could make that Mark Zuckerberg is more important than any world leader, because he can decide, literally, he personally can decide what you're allowed to post on Facebook or not in any country. And, he gets lobbied by the government and whatever, but he does decide, and he really controls a lot of public discourse. And so for us, journalists are in a position where it's really difficult to actually show what is Facebook doing or not doing in a particular country, because they hear a report here, an anecdote there. And so we have tried to take a systematic approach to that by building this sort of unique thing, which is a representative panel of users across the US who have allowed us to tap into their Facebook feed, analyze that data so that we can say systematically, right, Facebook is doing this, right? So some of the things that we found is that systematically Facebook was promoting political groups even in the run-up to the presidential election and in the period after, despite having promised Congress repeatedly that they were not going to promote political groups because of the election season, right? We just published a story yesterday saying that Facebook in Germany, where we have set up another panel, is promoting the far-right group in our panelists' news feeds at 3 times as frequently as any other political group, despite the fact that the far-right group is actually a very small group and their supporters are a small portion of our panel. And so this systematic approach allows us to move beyond the suspicions and intuition that people have relied on and say, no, factually, we have an independent sample and it looks like you're doing X. And then Facebook has to respond. Now, Facebook generally responds like they did yesterday with our Germany reporting. Well, your sample is too small. Okay, my sample is very small. I
saw that they responded a bit late, though.
But they missed the deadline for responding, and then they posted it on Twitter. But, the fact is, yes, our panel is never going to be, they have 2 billion users. we have a panel of about 1,000 in the US and about 500 in Germany. We are definitely not, right? We're not trying to claim that we have the answer, but what we are saying is we have the only independent view that you can get. And the independent view shows something that is pretty different than what they're marketing.
Correct. So I think it also leaves very little space for detractors. So Julia, would you also extend this approach to say, the kind of story Wall Street Journal did, like they accessed internal research documents at Facebook. So like if you were the editor and you had that story, would you say, and if it doesn't cause any harm to your source and if it's in public interest, would you release those documents? Because a lot of criticism and detractors to that report are saying that maybe Wall Street Journal should release all the documents that they have in store with them. So like, how would you respond if you had that story?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I just want to say to anyone out there who's thinking of leaking us documents, please come visit us. We are always open for business. Yeah, I would have loved to get that document trove that was leaked to the Wall Street Journal. I think it's very difficult to say whether we would have released them more or less than what they released. And I think the reason is source protection, right? You just can't tell. Sometimes documents can't be released because they're too identifying to the source. And so I don't want to second guess their decision there. I know that for us, we would always push to release the most possible because I think that's the best service to the public. But you definitely, when somebody has risked their job and their life to provide you information, you have to take steps to make sure that it's safe, they're safe. And one thing that we do, and I think is a best practice, is often not to release the raw documents, but to rebuild them. So basically, if somebody releases you a slide, there might be secret stuff in that you can't tell from the eye, but reveals the source. This is what happened to Reality Winner, who was this NSA leaker. There were secret dots in the background of the slides that she gave to The Intercept. And it turns out the NSA was keeping track of each different little bit of dots. And so they could tell who the leaker was. So in general, in today's sophisticated tech world, my feeling is best practice is to rebuild any sort of document that you get and place it, and so that it's a new, clean representation of the information. That said, that is stressful for the public who is seeking trust, right? The public prefers a raw document because they're like, okay, this is really real, right? So that's one reason to invest in building trust with your readers, so that when you have that occasional exception where you have to show them an altered version, you've built enough trust by releasing documents and data previously so that hopefully they trust you the few times that you do have to alter them.
Correct. Now, again, one of the direct consequences of this consistent reporting on platform is that platforms will inherently become a lot more secretive. So, in fact, I think it yesterday or today, like New York Times has done a piece on what is Facebook's sort of game plan going forward, and it has a lot to do with, of course, controlling the flow of information, but also sort of closing any access to the data. So earlier in the year, I think they seized access to NYU's ad observatory. Also, I think you also faced similar issues with the Citizen browser. So as someone, because Markup's work and a lot of reporting on big tech is inherently dependent on using the data or access that these companies provide. So like, how challenging do you think it will be if, like, let's just say companies like Facebook, Google, or any other platform companies just stop giving access to like researchers and think tanks? And do you think that we need to have like a policy framework or something? Because essentially this data is being used in public interest. Do you think we need like a policy framework that mandates that companies cannot block access to that data, at least for journalists and researchers?
Well, I think there's two kinds of data access, right? There's data that's already publicly available, and then there's data that's sort of, provided to certain types of partners, right? So for instance, the NYU researchers were cut off from Facebook's API, which is provided to partners who agree to certain terms. It was wrong and they shouldn't have done it, but it also is their discretion to who they want to partner with. What we do is we mostly collect data that's publicly available, right? So we scraped 15,000 search queries on Google, analyzed them, showed that Google puts its own products at the top of the page, hogs the top of the page, almost half of the top of the page for search results. And that data is public, right? So, but there's a legal battle about whether journalists can access publicly available data, because many websites say in their terms of service, which no one has ever read, like, don't scrape our page. And so the legal battle about that is playing out throughout the US. We have filed a brief at the Supreme Court arguing that publicly available data should be available to journalists, whether or not somebody writes a little thing in their terms of service saying you can't have it. It's kind of like if you put a billboard up on the highway, you can't say no one can take a picture of it, right? And that's essentially the argument that a lot of these tech companies are making. So I would say right now, the most defensible battle for journalists is just that we should be able to collect data that's already public, right? The idea of then asking companies to open a special door for us, I feel like, is actually a secondary battle. And it's one that I'm not sure about, because to be honest, like, as a journalist, if a company came to me with a data set, like let's say I was a reporter covering oil and gas, and Chevron gave me a data set and said, like, this proves that like oil doesn't cause climate change. I mean, I would say, okay, I'll take a look at that data, but I'm going to cross-check it with a lot of other data. So the idea that journalists should really rely on these companies to give them vetted data, I think actually leads to actually more capture, because they're not going to provide data that doesn't make them look good.
Correct. And I guess if they are providing data, they'll provide data that sort of suits them. Okay.
Yeah.
So, Julia, let me zoom out a little bit and I want to talk about specifically for online speech. If you see, there is massive inequality. If you look at what platforms do to moderate speech, say in US, vis-a-vis the kind of investment and what they do in markets like India, Brazil, and so on and so forth. Yeah. So clearly whatever they are, anyway, you can argue that all these platforms are doing very little when it comes to misinformation and online speech, but all of that work and investment and resource is focused on US. I think a big part of that reason is the language, because as you move out of US, you have multiple languages. But another big part is that because there is so much of scrutiny and accountability within media, and of course, these are American companies at the end of the day. But if you look at, especially in countries like Brazil and India, like in India, what has happened is the kind of misinformation and online hate, it's now being used to mobilize voters. So it's gone to a level where I don't think we have like a similar thing, say in US or Europe. There is a lot of misinformation, but using that hate and misinformation to sort of polarize people and effectively use it as a tactic. Like I was mentioning it to you, like we have people in the government who have sort of argued that they have the agency to make anything go viral as long as it suits their narrative. So as someone who follows big tech, how do you think we can hold American companies accountable to what they do outside in India? We know what happened in Myanmar and in countries like Philippines and Brazil. And B, how important do you think for organizations like yours and others who are reporting on tech to also sort of look at data and look at issues outside US, because that's the one that is not getting any media coverage or attention at this point of time?
Yeah, I mean, this is something I think about a lot, because we're this small startup in New York, 30 people, 20 in the newsroom, and we write mostly about the US because, that's where we are. But, the harms of these big tech platforms are probably greater outside the US. And so I've been trying to figure out ways to work more outside the US while still working within the constraints of being a tiny company. And so that's sort of what we did with our first ever international partnership with Germany, which is the one I was just referring to, where we were monitoring Facebook leading up to their elections, which are, I think, later this week. And so we're experimenting with ways that we could provide our tools to other newsrooms, because a lot of what our special sauce is our tools. And so if we can provide other newsrooms with the ability to use our tools, then maybe we can help promote this type of accountability work. That said, I would also say, though, there was plenty of great journalism about what was going on in Myanmar that wasn't based on tools, right? Literally just people reporting what they saw on Facebook. And And that's still a very good route. And so I think there is a route for lots of journalists to hold these platforms accountable. And I think there is a lot of great journalism actually happening along those lines. I just would love to be able to supercharge them with some more automated tools if possible.
Correct. But within newsrooms, like you said, but do you think that that's a viewpoint that like other journalists and other editors also share, that we effectively also have to start writing or start looking at issues and what the companies are doing outside US? Or do you think right now we aren't really there because there's so much happening within US that first you would rather do a good job as to what's happening in US and then move on?
I mean, I think there is definitely an interest in covering more outside the US. Definitely the big papers, the New York Times, Washington Post, are devoting a lot more to it. There's a new startup called Rest of World that is actually entirely devoted to really covering tech in other countries. And so I think there is a growing understanding of it, but the media industry, as you may know, is kind of in a really bad space right now. The ad revenue has plummeted. A lot of news outlets are really struggling. Only a few national outlets are really doing well, and the rest of the industry is kind of collapsing. So it's just, we don't have a very viable business model for journalism at all, right? And then when you add something like what I'm doing, which is like really expensive, as you said, programmers are expensive. The ones who come to work for me, they often take massive pay cuts, and yet they're still the most expensive people in my newsroom, right? And so, so doing what I'm doing in particular is a particularly expensive kind of journalism that not a lot of places are willing to invest in when their business model is collapsing. And that's, I think, even more true around the world, right? Where a lot of news outlets are struggling as well, and not, and the kind of thing that I'm doing is something that's just really hard to imagine investing in.
Correct. Now, before I move on to the next question, if you're watching this and you have questions for Julia, do go to www.themediarumble.com/live. We'll be taking questions from there in a few minutes. So if you have a question, do post there. But Julia, picking up on the revenue, you have a reader-supported model like we do at Newslaundry. And one of the fascinating thing is that you have a policy to not track user data. So you don't use any third-party trackers. You also try to store as little data as possible. And I've seen your surveys and other practices to do that. So that is very interesting because that's something that I directly work on. So now at Newslaundry, we've been ad-free from day one. That's a core USP, and that's where our entire independent journalism is based on. But even then, like even someone like Newslaundry, wherein we don't mind user data to sell it to advertisers or monetize it, we do end up using a third-party tracker, say Google Analytics. And I think most newsrooms in the world will use Google Analytics, not because they would want to share data with Google, just because it's so accessible, easy to use it and get data from there. So first, how important is the decision for your journalism wherein you will not track user activity on your website? And secondly, how difficult does it make for you? Because if you are a reader-supported model, you need to understand your audience and readers better. And the one way to do it is to collect some data around it. So how difficult is it when you're not collecting any data? And why is that decision so intrinsic to the kind of journalism you do at Markup?
Well, I'll start with the question about why we do it, which is, for myself, I was a tech reporter for dozens of years, a long time. And for a long time, I've been covering privacy as one of the top issues. And almost all of the time that I was writing about privacy at the Wall Street Journal and then at ProPublica, I would write a story, something like, oh, there's this new creepy thing that's happening on the internet. They're tracking you this way, that way, this way. And then I would have to put in parentheses, and oh, by the way, the website you're reading this on is also doing that, right? Like, so my employer was often using some of these creepy techniques. And so it was just an awkward position to be in as a reporter, right? And I would have to get comment often from the Wall Street Journal. Like I would call the business side and include their comment in my story about why are you doing this thing. And I felt like it also broke trust with readers because they were like, well, you're writing about this as if it's bad, but you're literally participating in it too. And so when I was founding the Markup, I wanted to see if we could build something that was different, that would also engender more trust with readers. And like you said, encourage them to donate, right? Because our model is all about donation. And so I thought, why do we need to track these people? Because it makes them feel terrible. And we already know they care about tracking we cover. So we know that this is a group that's interested in this issue. And really, we don't need that information, right? we're not selling ads. The reason you need to know all this stuff is actually oftentimes because you want to sell ads and the advertisers want to know, well, am I reaching men or women or what's the income, whatever. We're not selling ads, right? We're also, not really going to change what we're writing about just because we found out that people who read us are higher income or lower income, right? So it's not going to change our fundamental business too much to know these details about people, and it will really break the trust with them. And so it feels like it's a bet, but it's been working pretty well as a bet. And I will say that also we do get reader revenue, but most of our revenue is from really major donors, large donors, right? So who are foundations and private individuals. And so we're not entirely relying on small dollars. And in that world of small dollar donation, you probably would need, if you were going primarily that route, you probably would need a little bit more information to be able to more targeted in your messaging. And so, so it's an experiment. We'll see how well it works. So far, fingers crossed, it's been working okay. So I'm, hoping we can keep doing it because I think it really does engender a lot of loyalty. The emails we get from people, they're so appreciative of this experience. And I also think it really is something important to model for the rest of the industry, which is that you don't need to do this, right? Like you don't need to make your readers feel totally exploited. Sometimes you might, because selling advertising almost always just leads directly to that, but you don't always have to.
Correct. Just very interesting, you mentioned like that most of it is like bigger donors and you don't rely entirely on smaller donors. But do you think that is an hindrance? Do you think tech journalism it's relatively difficult to raise money for like tech journalism, especially from regular readers and small donors as compared to say political reporting or reporting otherwise? Do you think that's an hindrance? And that's why you don't see a lot of tech reporting in countries outside US?
I don't know I actually don't think it's tech specific. I think it's investigative journalism. So investigative journalism is, we do it. That's our main thing, right? But it's kind of depressing to read, right? So it's never going to have, I think, the loyal reader base maybe that like something with more fun will have. And so I think actually the reason that it's difficult is that not everybody wants to come every day and read a thing about how, a company's doing a bad thing. And so I think that investigative newsrooms in general have largely been supported. ProPublica is the main model for this, and they're largely supported by major donors, big foundations, individuals who want that public impact. And Texas Tribune is another one like this. And these are our comparisons, and they basically have at most, 10 to 20% reader support as part of their revenue. And then the rest of it is mostly major donors.
Okay. So, Julia, so you've been investigative journalist for long, and you've been covering tech for at least more than a decade. Mm-hmm. How do you think the field has changed from where you started? I was watching one of your interviews. I think the first beat was you were asked to cover the entirety of the internet. So, how has the space changed? Is there more appetite for stories around tech? Like, how has the space changed both for a reporter and for the reader?
It's gotten much better. When I became a tech reporter, most tech coverage was really, I would say, gadget focused. What's the new gadget? And it was very much review focused, right? Like, is it good? Should I buy it? It was very consumer focused. Like, should I buy this thing? Should I not buy this thing? And there wasn't as much coverage about, well, what does it mean for the world, right? And I think of it a little bit like health coverage, right? So you can read, there's personal health coverage, which is like, should I eat, is yogurt good for me or bad for me, right? And I think tech was like that, but there wasn't a lot of the like public health coverage, which is like, the way that hospitals are pricing their procedures is unfair and hurts society, which is also a well-developed area of coverage. And there's just basically health coverage is a more mature field. And so there are people in both pieces of it. I think what's happening with tech is we're just starting to develop that public health aspect of our coverage. So we have, in the past, I guess, 5 years, there's been a real push towards more understanding of like the broader issues and not just so much about like your choices, because it's not always about your personal choices. Like you don't have a personal choice in whether Facebook allows a certain thing or doesn't allow a certain thing,
Correct. Just I'll start taking questions. I think I can see one question, but before that, I also wanted to have you weigh on the kind of self-governance structures platforms are making. So Facebook has the oversight board. I think they're also sort of toying with the idea of doing something very similar for elections. So where do you exactly see these self-governance structure? Do you think they play an important role? Are they effective? Or do you think it's mostly like a PR exercise to save face?
Well, generally, companies start doing these type of self-regulatory regimes when they're trying to avoid actual regulation. And certainly there is a lot of efforts around actually regulating these companies, right? For a long time, Washington was really standoffish about tech, and because it was our biggest industry, right? It was they're printing money over there in Silicon Valley, and nobody wanted to get in the way of it. But in the past couple of years, there's been a growing sentiment in Washington. There's been bills to break up the tech companies. There's been bills to regulate them. There's been antitrust lawsuits. And so I think you see the rise of self-regulation and the promotion of self-regulation as a way for the industry to try to argue, don't worry, we're taking care of it ourselves, right? And so I would say that that's generally where you see self-regulation. It's not as if companies come up with self-regulation just because they're good people, right? Like they do it because of a business need,
Correct. Another thing is, like I said in the beginning also, I think for the longest time, the big tech and platform enjoy like a lot of praise, so to say, right? Like they were seen, and I think there's still a lot of innovation happening in these companies. But unlike now, where there is a lot of scrutiny, media attention, I think let's just say 5 years back, there wasn't really, like everyone thought that like when like a platform said that we want to make this world a better place or like connect people in community, people really bought into that. So, but you, like I said, you've been covering for long. So do you think when you did stories on internet companies or platforms, did you face like resistance? Did it not get as much attention or feedback from readers, or it's not really, that hasn't really changed in like say last 5 or 6 years? Has the readers' appetite or readers' feedback or attention to stories around platform and tech changed because readers are a lot more aware, or that hasn't really changed? For example, for how long has you been doing?
No, I think readers have become more aware. When I first started writing about these kinds of things, I would often get a lot of pushback from people saying, why are you raining on this parade? Like, this is the greatest thing. And look, it is amazing. We carry a supercomputer around in our pocket, right? That's what a phone is. And like, I think there is a lot of great stuff about it, but I did used to get much more negative feedback about like, why are you such a downer? When I started this series at the Wall Street Journal called What They Know About Privacy in 2010, there's a pundit online named Jeff Jarvis who said that I was creating a moral panic and that I was going to bring down the internet. Yeah, and that I was going to destroy the internet, and I was like, well, I was actually really proud. I was like, if you think I personally can destroy the internet, like that's super cool. But now, Jeff in particular is like Mr. Critic, right? So people like him have come around because, the conventional wisdom has come around, and people are more aware. And I think that honestly, the election of Trump and the Brexit vote were a real wake-up call for a lot of people about the fact that this wasn't just about creepy ads following you around. It was about the ability of political actors to use the micro-targeting capacities to feed misinformation to the people who are most vulnerable to receive it. And I think realizing that, I think, was a wake-up call for a lot of people.
Correct. I can see one question, so I'll just ask. Tapsi Bhardwaj asks, please comment on media imperialism. Okay, I think that's the question. I'm not sure what
media imperialism,
but maybe a big corporates running the largest of the media networks. So,
yeah, you know, U.S. media in particular and British media have a long history of acting very colonial in their coverage, right? Like there's, I remember that there was a period of time where every single article I read in the New York Times about India started with like a cow wandering the streets. They'd be like, in India, in New Delhi, there's a cow wandering the streets and they're debating this very interesting thing here. You know, it is very, you know, just like, it had that feeling like I'm here with the natives, you know.
And more on the video also, like any documentary or film on India will start in a crowded street. With
right.
Like cows around the corner.
Cows and rickshaw drivers and like, you know, yeah. And, you know, my husband's Indian. I go to India every year and I know there's a lot more to the country than that stereotype. And what I think is really great is that I think that one of the great things about the internet is that it made that kind of reporting less palatable. The truth is that now, if you want to know what's happening in another country, when you Google around, you can just read the local press or you can read a really informed person about it. And you don't have to rely on that sort of, you know, anthropological view that is often presented by some of the more mainstream outlets. And I think that has forced actually the big papers and their foreign correspondents to be more sophisticated in their coverage, right? So I think you see a little bit less of that now, but it's still there, you know? So, and that's one reason I would say the markup is I'm a little bit cautious about how we expand internationally. I don't want to be what I call a parachute journalist, where you just jump into a country, write a story, leave. I want to build tools and find ways to support local journalists to amplify and augment their reporting, because they know more about what's going on the ground than ever know.
Correct. Now, coming back to platforms, specifically about online speech, do you think our expectations from platforms, right? Like there should be as less misinformation as possible. They should not have algorithms or systems that encourage online hate, for that matter. Do you think our expectation is directly in odds with the kind of business model these companies have? So in fact, one of the stories that were there in the Wall Street Journal was how one of the changes that Facebook pushed, which was advertised as prioritizing friends and family content over political content, what it ended up doing was it made people more angry, and then political parties sort of gamed their game according to that. So do you think that's basically what the core of the problem is, that because of network effect, because these systems and products are designed for user engagement, are designed for time spent or whatever, they're not designed for keeping safety or privacy in mind? Do you think inherently there is a dichotomy, and that's why like platforms get in trouble?
I mean, I think there's a lot of reasons they get in trouble, but that focus on engagement is definitely one of them, right? And that's driven by the advertising model, right? So the advertising model is you need to keep people's eyeballs focused on the content for as long as possible. And, you know, I took a class in business school about how you motivate people, and we read all this Shakespeare and stuff. It was very interesting. And at the end of the class, he was like, look, we could talk about all the things we learned, or we could just say there's really only two ways to motivate people: fear or greed. And I think that, like, honestly, like, there's an element of truth to that, right? Like, people, if you're scared, you focus and you get angry, and like those things get you engaged in a way. And so when that Wall Street Journal article came out showing the point system they had for how they optimized the algorithm, it was clear that it was going to lead to more sort of outrage porn, which is what ultimately these platforms have ended up being. And so I think there's an element of their business model that is driven by advertising that like means there's always a tension between what they say they want to do and what they're actually doing. And it's worth remembering that the old days, when there were few media gatekeepers, right? So the editors of the Wall Street Journal and the editors at NBC who decided what was on the nightly news, they also made these calculations, right? And they were all white men, and but there was a sense of public interest. And so, I went to the Wall Street Journal meetings where they would say, like, what should we put on the front page? Obviously, if you just put puppies and anger, outrage every day, it would be more interesting to readers. But there was a sense that you need to include the war in Syria because it's actually important for readers to know about that. Same thing with the nightly news. Like, of course, they would rather just cover like, O.J. Simpson driving down the highway, but they also felt a responsibility to cover the world. And that sense of public interest was driven by, human motivations. And it was obviously flawed. There were all sorts of issues they didn't cover, like racial and gender discrimination, and they had an imperial model. That said, the algorithm doesn't have any of that in it, right? It doesn't have a public interest nozzle. And, Facebook came out today again with yet another, like, here's how we promote stuff. And they keep saying that they have some sort of public interest, threshold in their algorithm, but there's just no evidence to suggest that it's really working that well.
Okay, and I'm also, of course, all the algorithms are opaque, so there is no way for us to.
No way to know. Exactly. Okay, so I think what has happened in India a couple of times, that a couple of outlets that have reported very critically on the government, their Facebook pages have been banned, or like for a couple of days it didn't work. Now, there is no, of course, there is no documentation or proof to say that because they reported critically on the government, it got like blocked or it wasn't available for a couple of days. But we've seen it happening. I think it happened with Mother Jones also in US. So at Markup, because you report on all these platforms, is it also like a strategy to not have your distribution entirely based on all these platforms and look for other ways? Or you can't, like as a media publisher, you can't really help it? Well, we're definitely on all the platforms because it's kind of like you have to be, but we are very concerned about that. And so we have a strong newsletter subscriber base. We do partnerships with a lot of like established media outlets. We published our last investigation with the Associated Press, so it ran on the AP Wire and was picked up by nearly 300 papers across the country. So we try to find other ways to distribute our work so that we're not entirely reliant, but we're on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, because you have to be, like, it's just sort of the way you have to be in media.
Correct. So I think there's one more question. I'll just quickly, before we wrap up, this is from Rahul Bishnoi. Please comment on the overshadowing of media on the big tech over traditional newsroom based media. Okay, overshadowing of media on big tech over traditional newsrooms. Okay, I don't really understand.
I'm not sure I understand that question either.
Okay, maybe if Rahul can get back to us. But thank you so much for your time, Julia. Really appreciate for you taking your time. Hopefully you can do more stories that concerns us and in India also, and maybe you can collaborate with some newsrooms in India. So
yeah, I hope so.
To that. But yeah, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.